10 seconds. That's all Vanessa Harlan gave him before security would drag a maintenance worker off the executive floor in
This
front
is a
of 40
private meeting.
investors
State
who'd
your
flown in
business.
from New York,
I'm here to
Boston,
fix the
and
problem
Dallas
you can't
to
solve.
watch her unveil quarterly projections.
What have you
that would
done?
cement Harlan
Ma'am, it was
Dynamics
an accident.
as the
An
Midwest's
accident? This
most
is
profitable
disaster!
tech infrastructure firm. Garrett Aldrich didn't argue. He'd learned years ago that arguing with power rarely changed outcomes, only delayed consequences. The Navy work uniform felt heavier under the weight of their stares, fabric worn soft from industrial washers' shoulders, dusted with drywall powder he hadn't bothered brushing off after fixing the climate control vent on the 36th floor. His tool bag sat at his feet, canvas frayed at the corners containing wire strippers and voltage testers, and the kind of practical knowledge that kept buildings running when everyone else had gone home. The executive floor gleamed. Vermont marble stretched beneath recessed lighting that cost more per square foot than most people earned in a week. Glass walls separated the main reception area from the boardroom where champagne flutes waited on brushed steel trays untouched because serious money didn't celebrate until contracts were signed. Beyond those walls, Chicago's skyline cut sharp angles against afternoon clouds, the kind of view reserved for people who made decisions that moved markets. Vanessa stood 10 feet away, arms folded, heels planted. Her Ralph Lauren suit fit like armor, charcoal gray crisp lines, not a thread out of place. Dark hair cut sharp at the shoulders, no longer than necessary styled to suggest control without vanity. The Tiffany watch on her left wrist caught light as she checked the time, a gesture meant to communicate that his presence had already consumed seconds she couldn't afford to waste. Pearls at her throat, subtle but real. Stuart Weitzman heels that added 3 inches. She didn't need for authority but wore anyway because presentation mattered in rooms where perception shaped reality. Security shifted closer. 2 men in dark suits, earpieces, barely visible hands, relaxed but ready. They'd been trained not to escalate unless necessary, but their proximity sent a clear message. Compliance was expected, resistance would be handled. Garrett pulled out his phone. The screen had a crack running diagonal from the upper right corner down to the Samsung logo, impact damage from when Sophie had knocked it off the kitchen counter 3 months ago while reaching for her medication. He didn't bother looking up as he dialed, thumb moving across numbers he'd memorized years before. Most of these investors had heard of Harlan Dynamics. Hold that thought. Vanessa's jaw tightened, muscle flexing beneath foundation that cost more than his monthly grocery budget. Escort him out. The investors watched. Some pretended not to, glancing at tablets, adjusting cufflinks, sipping water from bottles that cost $8 in the lobby cafe. Others stared openly, curiosity sharpening into something that resembled anticipation. A man in his 60s, silver hair, combed back navy suit with a Cornell pin on the lapel, leaned toward the woman beside him and whispered something that made her eyebrows lift. Before security could close the distance, the massive display screen inside the boardroom flickered. Just once. A half-second stutter in the revenue projections that had been cycling smoothly through investor-focused graphics, growth percentages, market penetration charts, client acquisition timelines. Most people missed it. Garrett didn't. His eyes tracked the reflection in the polished glass wall, catching the delay in the refresh rate, the microsecond lag that shouldn't exist in a system designed to handle real-time data streams worth hundreds of millions. He lowered the phone from his ear but didn't hang up. The line stayed open, silent on the other end, waiting. 3 seconds. Vanessa's voice carried the kind of certainty that came from never being contradicted in rooms like this. She'd built Harlan Dynamics from a regional IT consultancy into a national infrastructure powerhouse by trusting her instincts about when to push and when to pivot. And right now, every instinct told her that a man in work boots didn't belong anywhere near conversations about fiduciary responsibility and shareholder value. Across the glass wall, Claire Bexley stepped closer to the boardroom screen. Chief Legal Officer 45, gray suit, tailored to suggest competence without flash. She'd spent 12 years in corporate litigation before Vanessa hired her away from a firm that charged $800 an hour for contract review. Her frown deepened as she tapped the tablet in her hand, trying to pull up the investor portal that should have been mirroring the main display. "Is that a delay?" The question came out quiet almost to herself, but in the hush that had fallen over the executive floor it carried. No one answered. The screen cycled forward, catching up, resuming its smooth progression through carefully vetted numbers that told the story Vanessa needed investors to believe: sustainable growth, scalable infrastructure, minimal risk exposure. Garrett's gaze never left the numbers. He'd seen this pattern before. 8 years ago, during the final security audit he'd conducted before stepping down, he'd flagged a vulnerability in the legacy authentication cascade, a structural weakness buried so deep in the original code that most engineers wouldn't recognize it unless they'd built the system from scratch. The risk assessment had been clear: if the root partition was ever outsourced to third-party vendors prioritizing cost over security, the entire authentication framework could be exploited through dormant maintenance nodes that no one remembered existed. They'd outsourced it anyway. 3 years ago, during a cost optimization push that saved the company 8% on operational overhead and earned Derek Strauss a promotion to Chief Infrastructure Strategist. 5 seconds. The words came out sharper now, Vanessa's patience eroding into something that resembled genuine irritation. She didn't raise her voice, didn't need to. The silence behind her carried more weight than shouting ever could. Assistants froze mid-step. Junior executives stopped pretending to check emails. Even the investors who'd paid for the privilege of being skeptical went quiet. Garrett spoke into the phone, voice low enough that only the people closest could hear fragments. "Yeah, it's happening again. It's happening. Same signature." The screen flickered a second time. Longer. 3 full seconds where the financial dashboard froze, mid-transition numbers hanging suspended in digital amber, before lurching forward with the kind of stuttering recovery that suggested something deeper than a simple refresh glitch. Vanessa heard it in the murmurs that rippled through the boardroom, saw it in the way Claire's expression shifted from mild concern to focused attention. One of the assistants, young woman, blonde, expensive blazer, first day on the executive floor, rushed toward the central console where the presentation controls lived. Security hesitated. They'd been told to remove anyone who didn't belong, but the man they were supposed to escort out had just made a phone call that coincided with visible system problems and the optics of dragging him away, while screens malfunctioned in front of investors, suggested complications neither of them wanted to explain in incident reports. Garrett ended the call. The hum in the walls deepened, barely perceptible unless you'd spent years learning to hear the difference between normal operational vibration and the strain of servers pushing against thermal limits. He'd installed half the cooling infrastructure in this building back when Harlan Dynamics occupied 3 floors instead of 12, back when Vanessa was still VP of Operations and treated him like a colleague instead of a problem to be managed. "Ma'am," his voice carried the kind of calm that came from knowing exactly how bad things could get. "If I leave right now, you're about to lose more than this meeting." A few investors exchanged looks. The audacity of it, a maintenance worker telling a CEO what she stood to lose, would have been amusing if the screens hadn't chosen that exact moment to flicker again, this time accompanied by a soft electronic tone that pulsed from the main display like a heartbeat struggling to find rhythm. Claire's voice cut through the quiet, no longer whispering. "Rowena, our investor access portals just froze." Not a question, a statement. The tablet in her hand showed error strings where clean interface should have been, authentication failures cascading across screens that were supposed to be showing carefully curated financial data to people whose decisions could move tens of millions in capital. Murmurs broke the room's polished stillness. An older investor, the one with the Cornell pin, pulled out his phone, swiping through what Garrett assumed were backup access credentials. His frown deepened. The woman beside him did the same, fingers moving faster, urgency replacing the casual confidence they'd worn when champagne was still the biggest concern. Security still stood beside Garrett, uncertain now, waiting for direction that hadn't come. Vanessa's confidence didn't crack, not visibly, but something in her posture shifted, spine straightening, an extra half-inch, shoulders pulling back in the way people did when they felt control slipping and needed to project the opposite. "That's impossible," Another assistant spoke from the console, young man, this time thin-framed glasses, tie loosened from stress. It's not just here. Remote shareholders are reporting session terminations. The authentication portal is rejecting executive credentials across the board. The temperature seemed to drop. Not literally, the climate control Garrett had fixed an hour ago was working perfectly, but the psychological shift was immediate. Investors who'd been casually engaged were now fully alert, phones out, questions forming behind expressions that had gone from politely interested to professionally concerned. Garrett shifted his wide eyes, scanning the reflection of scrolling code in the glass wall. He didn't look surprised. He looked certain, the way someone does when they've been waiting for a specific disaster and finally watching it arrive on schedule. Vanessa turned back toward him slowly, each movement deliberate, controlled. "What did you do?" "I didn't do anything." He exhaled through his nose, a sound that might have been frustration or resignation or both. That's the problem. The electronic hum thickened, punctuated now by the faint vibration of overworked servers somewhere below their feet, systems straining against loads they weren't designed to handle. The building had been engineered for redundancy, multiple fail-safes layered across critical infrastructure, but redundancy only worked if the foundation itself was secure. And right now, someone was exploiting a crack in that foundation that shouldn't exist unless they knew exactly where to look. Claire studied him carefully, lawyer instincts kicking in, weighing credibility against stakes. "You said again. What did you mean?" Garrett hesitated, then answered evenly. "There's a breach pattern in your legacy architecture. It masks itself as latency before it spreads to authentication nodes." Several executives stared blankly. Technical jargon that might as well have been spoken in another language for all the meaning it carried. But Vanessa understood. He could see it in the way her eyes narrowed, irritation shifting into calculation, the mental gears turning as she reassessed the situation from threat to puzzle to potential catastrophe. "Your maintenance." Her voice dropped lower, words chosen carefully now, each one a probe testing for vulnerability. "You wouldn't even have access to that level of infrastructure." "I don't." Calm, factual. No defensiveness, no pride, just information delivered the way someone might report structural damage they'd discovered but couldn't fix alone. "But I built the layer underneath it." The words landed heavier than they sounded. Silence pressed in thicker, now weighted with implications that rippled outward from a simple declarative statement. An investor near the glass muttered something, built, like the word itself needed verification. The screens flickered violently. Not a subtle stutter this time, but a full system spasm that replaced financial charts with blinking warnings about compromised encryption certificates. Somewhere in the building, an alarm chirped, once sharp and insistent, then died as if someone had hit a manual override before the sound could spread panic beyond the executive floor. Claire's eyes widened, professional composure cracking just enough to show genuine alarm beneath. "Vanessa, if this propagates to client accounts—" "It won't." Garrett interrupted, voice firmer now, carrying the authority of someone who understood the system's architecture better than the people currently trying to save it. "Not yet." Vanessa faced him, fully abandoning any pretense of dismissal. "Explain." He glanced toward the boardroom table where champagne flutes still sat untouched, condensation beating on crystal that cost more than his weekly paycheck. "Your current cybersecurity team patched surface vulnerabilities last quarter, but they never closed the original backdoor embedded in the authentication cascade. It's hidden in a cost-reduced update from 3 years ago." Her jaw tightened. "We invested heavily in that system." "I know." Another pulse rippled through the monitors. The service elevator behind them dinged, doors sliding open to reveal 2 frantic IT analysts rushing out with tablets in hand, faces showing the kind of panic that came from watching critical infrastructure fail in real time and having no idea how to stop it. One of them froze when he saw Garrett. Recognition flickered across his face, confusion mixing with something that looked like relief. "Sir," he started, then caught himself thrown by the Navy maintenance uniform that didn't match the mental image of the man who'd designed the system now falling apart. Vanessa, the breach signature matches an archived protocol labeled GA-09. The analyst's voice came out, rushed words tumbling over each other. It's tagged as the original security framework revision. We thought it was decommissioned. It wasn't. Garrett didn't react outwardly. No satisfaction at being proven right, no smugness at their oversight, just the weight of knowing he'd warned them and been ignored. Claire's gaze sharpened like glass under pressure. GA stands for what? Garrett Aldrich. A low murmur spread across the executive floor, invisible current running through the crowd as understanding clicked into place. The IT analyst swallowed hard, looking between Garrett and Vanessa like he'd just realized he was standing in the middle of something far more complicated than a technical crisis. He designed the first-generation encryption matrix before the public launch. The words came out quieter now, careful, as if speaking too loudly might shatter whatever fragile détente was forming in the space between corporate hierarchy and technical necessity. Several heads turned sharply toward Garrett, now not looking at the uniform, but at the man inside it. Investors who'd written him off as an interruption were reassessing, recalculating, trying to reconcile the maintenance worker who'd nearly been escorted out with the architect whose code was apparently the only thing keeping their portfolios from collapsing. Vanessa's expression hardened, but doubt crept beneath it, visible in the slight hesitation before she spoke. "You left this company nearly a decade ago." "My daughter got sick." He said it simply, no elaboration needed, no justification offered. "I stepped down." The words weren't defensive, just factual. A decision made, consequences, accepted life, recalibrated around what mattered when everything else became noise. Behind the glass, another alarm sounded, longer this time, sustained, the kind of warning that suggested automated systems had detected problems beyond simple latency. Claire stepped closer to Garrett, voice dropping to something that resembled urgency, wrapped in professional courtesy. "Can you stop it?" His eyes returned to the screens where code scrolled faster, now probing deeper layers, testing boundaries with the methodical precision of someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. "Yes, but not from here." Vanessa hesitated. Just a fraction of a second, but visible to everyone watching. That fraction carried weight, pride wrestling with pragmatism, control fighting necessity, the calculus of a CEO who'd spent 15 years making decisions that shaped markets, now facing a problem that couldn't be solved with authority alone. "Where," the word came out clipped, stripped of pretense, pure function. "The primary server vault, level B3. Garrett's voice stayed level. "The physical node still houses the root partition. If we isolate it before the exploit replicates, we contain the damage." The analyst nodded rapidly, relief flooding his expression. That's correct. The original architecture still runs through the B3 vault. If someone could access the root partition directly." He didn't finish. Didn't need to. Everyone understood what he wasn't saying, that the person most qualified to access that partition was standing in front of them, wearing work boots and carrying a tool bag. Another monitor went dark. Then another. The cascading failures spreading with the kind of geometric progression that suggested they were running out of time to make decisions that might still matter. Claire's voice cut in quietly but firmly, the lawyer in her recognizing the stakes better than most. "Vanessa, investors are starting to notice." Through the glass wall, uneasy conversations were growing louder. Phones being raised not for casual checks but for urgent calls, questions forming public, visible, uncontainable. The kind of speculation that once started could spiral into narratives that destroyed quarterly projections and tanked stock valuations before legal teams could draft damage control statements. Public exposure. Not the kind Vanessa wanted, not the kind anyone could spin. Garrett picked up his tool bag, movement deliberate, not as a laborer dismissed, but as someone preparing to walk toward something he understood better than anyone else in the room. The canvas strap settled across his shoulder, familiar weight tools inside that had fixed everything from HVAC systems to fiber optic relays over the past 8 years of maintenance work that kept him close to the building without tying him to travel schedules that didn't accommodate Sophie's appointments. Vanessa stepped aside. Not dramatically, not with any visible acknowledgement of what the gesture meant, but enough to clear physical space between him and the elevator. Security didn't touch him, hands dropping to their sides, eyes shifting toward their boss for direction that had fundamentally changed in the span of 5 minutes. Get it done. 2 words. No threats, no ultimatums, just the stripped-down communication of someone who'd run out of better options. Garrett moved toward the elevator. The hum of the skyscraper deepened like a machine recognizing its original maker had just returned systems straining under loads they were never meant to handle. Infrastructure crying out for the kind of understanding that came from knowing every vulnerability because you'd been there when they were designed into the foundation. The service doors slid open with a metallic sigh. He stepped inside. Claire followed without hesitation, legal instinct telling her that whatever happened next needed a witness who could testify to intent and process. After a half-second of hesitation that didn't go unnoticed by the investors still watching, Vanessa followed too, heels clicking against steel flooring as she crossed from marble opulence into the utilitarian space where maintenance workers traveled when they needed to move through the building without disturbing the polished surfaces above. The doors sealed them off from the executive floor's chaos. Fluorescent light hummed overhead, harsh and unforgiving, the kind of illumination designed for function rather than comfort. The scent of marble polish gave way to metal and dust and the faint ozone smell of electrical systems working too hard. The digital display ticked downward, 38, 35, 32. Vanessa folded her arms, watching Garrett instead of the descending numbers. The maintenance uniform looked different in this light, less out of place, more like exactly what someone would wear if they actually understood how buildings worked beneath the aesthetic veneer that clients paid premium rates to admire. If this is some elaborate performance, it isn't. He said it evenly. No heat, no defensiveness, just the same factual tone he'd used upstairs when stating problems that required solutions regardless of who wanted to hear them. She watched him instead of the numbers now. The uniform, the worn boots, the calm breathing that suggested someone comfortable with pressure, because pressure was just another variable to be managed. None of it fit the archived personnel file forming in her memory, the brilliant young architect who'd revolutionized their security infrastructure at 26, who'd been on track for VP before walking away from everything they'd built together. You designed the original encryption matrix. Statement, not question testing, whether the information matched what she remembered from a decade ago when his office was 3 doors down from hers and they'd spent late nights debugging code that would eventually process billions in transactions. He nodded once. And you never disclosed this vulnerability? I did. The reply came without hesitation. In the exit audit, it was flagged as a long-term risk if the root partition was ever outsourced. Claire's eyebrows knit together, legal mind already running through implications. Liability exposure, fiduciary responsibility, failures. We outsourced infrastructure optimization 3 years ago. The elevator dropped past level 12, descending into the building's mechanical depths where tourists never ventured and most employees forgot existed. Garrett said nothing, but his silence carried more weight than confirmation. Vanessa's jaw tightened, muscle flexing beneath skin that had held up remarkably well for 48 years of 14-hour days and quarterly pressure that would have broken someone with less resilience. That decision increased margins by 12%. It also created a bypass. His voice stayed quiet, controlled, carrying information without judgment. Whoever's exploiting this knows your internal architecture intimately. They're not attacking from outside. They're navigating through something familiar. A faint vibration traveled through the elevator cables, subtle, but there the building's nervous system responding to stress it wasn't designed to handle. Claire looked at the ceiling as if she could see through steel and concrete to the server farms straining 40 floors above them. Is the vault already compromised? Not yet. Garrett's eyes tracked the floor numbers. They're mapping. Once they mirror the authentication cascade, it spreads. Every executive credential becomes a doorway. Every client account becomes accessible. They're being patient because they can afford to be until someone stops them. The elevator dinged at B1 but didn't stop continuing downward into the sub-basement levels where building permits gave way to architectural necessity, where cooling systems and power distribution and fiber-optic trunks lived in climate-controlled spaces that never appeared in promotional materials or investor presentations. Vanessa studied him in the harsh fluorescent light, seeing him clearly for the first time in 8 years. Not as an employee who'd abandoned his post, not as a maintenance worker interrupting important meetings, but as the only person in the building who understood the foundation well enough to save it. You expect me to believe you can outmaneuver a coordinated cyber attack because you wrote the first draft of our system. I don't expect you to believe anything. His response came without edge, just the weariness of someone who'd learned that expectations rarely matched outcomes. I expect you to decide whether you want this contained before your investors watch their portfolios evaporate in real time. The words weren't loud. Didn't need to be. Silence pressed into the tight space, carrying the weight of decisions made years ago that were finally coming due. The doors opened at level B3. Cool air rolled in heavy with ozone and machine heat, the temperature carefully controlled to keep server equipment from overheating during peak load cycles. The corridor beyond was narrower than the executive halls above, lined with exposed piping and reinforced concrete industrial aesthetics stripped of any pretense toward beauty. Security panels blinked red along the walls, warning lights that had probably been ignored until 10 minutes ago when they started flashing in patterns that suggested someone had breached systems everyone assumed were impenetrable. This was the labor zone. The place meant for technicians and engineers and the people who kept infrastructure running when executives were home with their families. Not a place for CEOs in designer suits and Tiffany watches. Yet Vanessa stepped out first, heels clicking against concrete, surveying the corridor like she was evaluating a hostile acquisition target. Her shoulders stayed straight, posture perfect, every inch of her maintaining the illusion that she belonged in spaces like this, even though everyone knew she'd spent the last decade avoiding them. 2 engineers were already there, arguing over a tablet. Voices tight with the kind of stress that came from watching critical systems fail and having no idea how to explain it to people who measured competence in uptime percentages. They froze when they saw Garrett emerge behind Vanessa. One whispered something that sounded like reverence wrapped in relief. The other just nodded, stunned, like seeing someone return from the dead. Garrett moved past them without ceremony, tool bag swinging slightly as he walked toward the primary vault door. Reinforced steel biometric locks, the kind of security designed to keep out everyone except the handful of people authorized to access the server banks that processed everything from payroll to patent filings. His hand brushed the cold metal fingers, lingering for half a breath as if reacquainting himself with something old and familiar. The panel beside the vault blinked an error code he'd never seen during his tenure as chief security architect. Red digits cycling through a sequence that shouldn't exist if the system was functioning according to original specifications. That's new. He murmured it to himself, but in the corridor's acoustics it carried. Vanessa crossed her arms again, the gesture lacking earlier certainty. Explain. They've inserted a recursive loop into the authentication handshake. His eyes tracked the error sequence reading patterns the way someone fluent in languages most people never learned. It forces the system to validate itself indefinitely while copying credentials. Every cycle creates a mirror image of executive access, perfect clones that look legitimate to automated security because they're generated from authentic sources. Claire looked at the engineer's legal training, demanding clarity. Can you shut it down? One shook his head, voice hollow with the resignation of someone who'd already tried everything he knew. We can't access root-level commands. It's locked behind legacy clearance protocols that were decommissioned during the infrastructure update 3 years ago. All eyes turned toward Garrett. The air inside the corridor felt charged, thick with heat radiating from the server banks behind reinforced walls. A low mechanical roar vibrated underfoot, constant and alive, the sound of machines working beyond capacity. Vanessa's voice dropped, stripped of pretense. Do you still have clearance? No. Simple. Direct. Then, but I have something better. He set his tool bag down and unzipped it with movements that suggested routine muscle memory from years of field work that didn't require thinking about which pocket held which instrument. Inside were standard maintenance tools, wrenches, insulated gloves, wire testers, and a small diagnostic tablet far older than the sleek devices the engineers carried. Scratched screen, outdated operating system, the kind of equipment that should have been recycled years ago, but had been kept because it still worked when nothing else did. The engineers exchanged doubtful glances. That device isn't even on our current network. It doesn't need to be. Garrett pulled out the tablet, fingers moving across the cracked screen with the confidence of someone who'd used this exact hardware to troubleshoot problems that would stump teams of consultants charging premium hourly rates. He connected a cable directly to a secondary maintenance port beneath the security panel, a port most executives probably didn't know existed, buried in documentation that predated the infrastructure update that had introduced the vulnerabilities now being exploited. The small screen flickered to lifelines of code scrolling in stark white against black command strings written in a syntax that looked archaic compared to modern development languages, but still functioned perfectly if you knew how to speak to the underlying architecture. Vanessa stepped closer, despite herself drawn by curiosity or necessity or both. "You kept access. I kept knowledge." He corrected her gently, fingers typing commands without looking at the keyboard. "Different thing." The engineers leaned in, watching as he navigated through layers of the system with the kind of precision that came from having built those layers from scratch, knowing every shortcut and backdoor because he'd created them for exactly this kind of emergency. He didn't rush. Each keystroke was deliberate, measured, the opposite of panic. Claire exhaled slowly, recognition dawning. "You're modifying it in real time." "I designed it to be flexible." His response came without looking up from the screen. Most people never needed to know that. Above them, the building shuddered faintly. Not enough to be dangerous, but enough to feel wrong infrastructure straining against loads it shouldn't be handling if everything was working according to specifications. An alert echoed through the corridor louder than before, demanding attention that couldn't be deferred. One engineer glanced at his tablet, face going pale. "They've started replicating user credentials. Executive-level access is being cloned across the network." Vanessa's composure cracked at last, professional mask slipping enough to show genuine alarm beneath. "How long?" "Minutes." The engineer's voice shook slightly. "Maybe less." Garrett's jaw tightened, sweat beading lightly at his temple, not from fear, but from the heat radiating through reinforced steel server farms, working hard enough to raise ambient temperature several degrees above comfortable. He adjusted the cable connection and typed another command sequence, movement steady despite the pressure. The old tablet paused. For half a second, nothing happened. Systems processing, evaluating, deciding whether to accept instructions from hardware that shouldn't have authority but carried credentials buried so deep in the original code that even comprehensive audits had missed them. Then the recursive loop on the main panel froze mid-sequence, error codes stuttering like a heartbeat caught between beats. The engineers stared, disbelief mixing with hope. "It stalled." Vanessa didn't smile, didn't relax. But for the first time since the screens had started flickering upstairs, she looked at Garrett not as an intruder or a problem or even a former colleague, but as the only person in the room who understood the battlefield they were standing on well enough to navigate it without a map. The vault door's security panel blinked from red to amber status, shifting from critical failure to controlled intervention systems, recognizing authority they'd been programmed to obey, even when that authority came from equipment everyone else had forgotten existed. The stalled code held for 3 seconds before a new line of script attempted to overwrite it. Faster, sharper, more aggressive than the initial probe. Garrett's fingers moved across the tablet without pause, rerouting the attack sequence into a containment buffer he'd designed years ago for exactly this scenario, a digital dead end that would let malicious code think it was progressing while actually suffocating itself in isolated memory. "They're adapting." One engineer breathed the words like a prayer that had gone unanswered. Heat pressed harder against the corridor walls, server farms pushing thermal limits as authentication requests multiplied exponentially. The mechanical roar behind the reinforced door deepened. Machines straining under computational loads that shouldn't exist if the breach was contained. Garrett didn't look up from the screen. They didn't expect resistance at this layer. This was supposed to be invisible. Claire moved closer, trying to parse meaning from code that looked like hieroglyphics to anyone without years of architecture experience. "Can you block it completely?" "Not block." His response came measured, focused entirely on the strings scrolling past. "Redirect." "Redirect to where?" "A sandbox partition." He typed another command, watching the system's response with the kind of intensity that suggested he was reading more than just code, understanding intent, predicting next moves, staying 2 steps ahead of whoever was orchestrating the attack. A dead environment. Let it think it's expanding while it suffocates itself. The second engineer nodded slowly, recognition dawning. "That partition hasn't been active since the initial architecture phase. It was supposed to be deleted during the infrastructure update." "Exactly." Garrett's voice carried the weight of decisions made years ago that were finally proving their worth. Hidden in plain sight, marked for deletion, but never actually removed, because the deletion protocols required root access that got locked behind the same legacy clearance they were trying to streamline away. The old diagnostic tablet hummed in his hands, battery indicator already dropping under the strain of processing commands that demanded more power than the outdated hardware was designed to deliver. He adjusted a setting, bypassing a security layer that hadn't been documented in any manual written since he'd left the company. Vanessa caught it, the way his fingers moved with absolute certainty through pathways that shouldn't exist in current system maps. "That access path isn't listed in our documentation." "It wouldn't be." "It wouldn't." No apology in the statement, just acknowledgement of reality. "I buried it." Her gaze sharpened, not with anger but calculation. "Why?" "In case someone powerful decided short-term optics mattered more than long-term security." The words landed without accusation, simply describing a possibility he'd prepared for, because experience had taught him that institutional memory failed faster than infrastructure. A tremor ran through the floor, subtle but unmistakable. One engineer checked his tablet again, urgency bleeding into his movements. "Credential replication is accelerating. It's copying executive-level access patterns." Claire's voice dropped, lower tension pulling her shoulders tight. "If that reaches investor accounts, it won't." Garrett said it again, though this time strain crept beneath the steadiness. The main panel flashed red, then white, cycling through warning states as the malicious code tried new vectors, probing for weaknesses in the containment he'd erected. Above them, faint through layers of steel and concrete, a chorus of notifications began echoing from upper floors. Phones buzzing, alerts firing across devices as automated monitoring systems detected anomalies too significant to ignore. Investors noticing something wasn't right, asking questions that would multiply into narratives beyond anyone's ability to control. Public. Visible. Exactly what Vanessa had feared most. She stepped back half a pace, absorbing implications, while maintaining the exterior composure that had carried her through hostile board meetings and aggressive acquisition attempts. "If this leaks outside this building," "It already has." Claire's interruption came flat, stripped of comfort. "Social feeds are asking why our stock preview stream paused mid-presentation." The CEO inhaled slowly, fighting the instinct to regain control through force of will. Authority didn't function against invisible code, couldn't command servers to ignore exploitation, couldn't demand that reality conform to quarterly projections. For someone who'd built an empire on the principle that decisive action shaped outcomes, the helplessness was visceral. Garrett adjusted the cable connection, sweat rolling down his temple and disappearing into his collar. His breathing remained measured despite the heat, the pressure, the knowledge that every second of delay gave the attack more time to replicate across systems designed to trust credentials that looked legitimate. The sandbox partition blinked into partial existence on the tablet screen, digital containers slowly materializing as outdated hardware struggled to execute commands that pushed it beyond factory specifications. Almost. The word came out quiet more to himself than the people watching. The engineers leaned closer, watching the progress bar crawl forward with agonizing slowness. The attack script hesitated again, confused by the rerouting algorithms trying to understand why expected pathways had suddenly redirected into unfamiliar territory. For a moment it appeared to retreat malicious code pulling back, as if whoever was controlling it had recognized the trap. Then a new burst of commands slammed into the authentication cascade, hitting with enough force that the main panel's display flickered and reset, cycling through boot sequences that shouldn't trigger unless something catastrophic had happened at the hardware level. "They've escalated." The first engineer's voice shook slightly. "This isn't random anymore. Someone knows the original framework well enough to—" He didn't finish. Didn't need to. Everyone in the corridor understood what he wasn't saying, that whoever was executing this attack had intimate knowledge of the system's foundation, the kind of understanding that came from either studying Garrett's original designs in forensic detail or from having been there when those designs were implemented. Garrett's jaw tightened, muscle flexing, as recognition settled into certainty. Only a handful of people had ever seen the blueprint of this system in its infancy, back when it was sketches on whiteboards and prototype code tested on hardware that barely qualified as professional grade. Only a few understood how its foundation intertwined with corporate identity layers, authentication cascades built to handle thousands of simultaneous access requests without creating bottlenecks that would slow legitimate business. He typed a final string of commands and pressed enter with more force than necessary. Nothing happened. The corridor seemed to hold its breath, heat pressing down from ventilation, struggling to keep pace with thermal output from server banks working triple their normal load. Then the recursive loop shattered into fragmented code attack sequence, redirected cleanly into the dormant sandbox partition. On the main panel, red warnings softened to amber error states transitioning to controlled intervention. The engineer stared in disbelief, tablet forgotten in his hands. "It's isolated, replication contained." Above them, the faint chorus of notifications diminished automated alerts, recognizing that whatever crisis had triggered warnings was being addressed, systems stabilizing into patterns that suggested human intervention rather than cascading failure. Vanessa closed her eyes briefly, absorbing the reprieve with visible effort. When she opened them, something had shifted in her expression. Not gratitude exactly, but acknowledgement that assumptions she'd held for 8 years about who deserved to be in which rooms might need recalibration. But Garrett didn't relax. His focus remained locked on fresh lines of data forming beneath the surface patterns emerging that shouldn't exist if the breach had been fully contained. "They're still inside." Claire blinked confusion, cutting through relief. "What? The breach isn't just the loop." He straightened slowly, eyes scanning details that would be meaningless to anyone who hadn't designed the underlying architecture. "That was the distraction. This is reconnaissance." The engineer's relief evaporated instantly, replaced by the kind of dread that came from realizing you'd celebrated too early. Vanessa stepped closer again, voice tight with control that was costing her more effort than she'd admit, meaning, "Whoever launched this knows the system intimately enough to test its boundaries without collapsing it." His voice remained level, but something colder threaded through it now, the tone of someone recognizing a pattern they'd hoped never to see. They were measuring response time, mapping who intervened. Claire's expression shifted from concern to calculation. "Mapping you." He didn't answer immediately. The sandbox partition stabilized on the tablet screen, holding the malicious code in suspended isolation. But in the lower corner, another anomaly blinked faintly, small enough that no one else noticed a secondary ping originating not from outside the firewall, but from within the corporate network itself. Internal, not external predators circling from anonymous servers scattered across continents, but something already inside the walls they thought they controlled. Garrett felt the weight of it settle in his chest, familiar and unwelcome. 8 years ago, he'd warned them about exactly this scenario, that cost-cutting measures which prioritized quarterly margins over structural integrity would create vulnerabilities that patient adversaries could exploit. They'd listened politely, filed the report, and proceeded with infrastructure updates that saved millions in operational overhead while introducing backdoors that wouldn't be discovered until someone with sufficient knowledge decided to use them. The breach didn't come from outside. He said it quietly, watching Vanessa's face as comprehension dawned. It started here. Silence fell heavier than before. Mechanical roar behind the vault door, suddenly sounding louder, almost accusatory. One engineer shook his head, denial reflexive. That's impossible. Internal access requires biometric clearance. Level 7 authentication. We'd know if someone— Yes, Garrett interrupted gently. It does. Vanessa's composure stiffened again, not with arrogance this time, but with dawning realization that the threat wasn't coming from anonymous hackers in unmarked server farms, but from somewhere much closer. Someone inside Harlan Dynamics had either opened the door deliberately or left it unlocked through negligence that crossed the line into liability. Betrayal within the walls they thought they controlled. The word didn't need to be spoken aloud. It hung there anyway, thick as the heat radiating through reinforced steel. Internal access requires Level 7 biometric clearance. Vanessa's words came out measured, each syllable carefully controlled. There are fewer than a dozen people with that authorization. Claire's eyes moved between them, lawyer instincts sharp. Including you. And you. The CEO's response came sharp, deflecting before the implication could settle. The engineers shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware they were witnessing something that belonged in closed-door meetings with legal counsel present, not in maintenance corridors where technicians weren't supposed to hear executives accusing each other of complicity. Garrett kept his focus on the small anomaly blinking at the corner of his tablet pulse, almost shy in its persistence. If he hadn't written the original monitoring code himself, he might have missed it entirely, just another data packet in an ocean of legitimate traffic. It's not active access. His voice cut through the tension building between Vanessa and Claire. It's a mirrored credential. The first engineer frowned, technical curiosity overriding political awareness. Mirrored, cloned, copied. Garrett corrected, pulling up diagnostic details that showed authentication tokens duplicated with precision that suggested someone had intimate knowledge of how biometric data was stored and validated. Somebody duplicated executive-level identity tokens and planted them internally. The breach loop was just a test, checking whether we'd notice. Vanessa absorbed this information with visible effort, pride, and urgency warring in her posture. She'd built her reputation on aggressive expansion, relentless forward motion, the kind of decisive leadership that didn't pause for second-guessing. Personal sacrifice for institutional security wasn't a language she'd ever publicly prioritized, wasn't a value she'd demonstrated when pushing through cost optimizations that made quarterly reports look impressive while undermining the foundation those reports were built on. Who would risk that? The question came out quieter than intended, almost vulnerable. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he rerouted the sandbox partition into deeper isolation, sealing the captured malicious code behind a secondary wall that would prevent any possibility of escape even if the first containment failed. The corridor lights flickered once as power distribution adjusted to accommodate the additional computational load. Above them, faint vibrations suggested renewed activity on executive floors. People scrambling to stabilize optics to craft narratives that would satisfy investors while pretending nothing serious had occurred. The gap between what was being said upstairs and what was actually happening down here would widen until someone forced transparency. We tell them it was a routine systems recalibration. Vanessa's words came out automatic instinct defaulting to damage control. That buys minutes, not credibility. Claire's response was immediate legal training overriding political convenience. If this breach went public before containment was complete, stock projections would crater, trust would fracture, headlines would multiply before sunset. Public exposure. Not the kind Vanessa wanted: carefully managed press releases and staged investor calls where narrative could be controlled. This would be raw, unfiltered, the kind of transparency that came from crisis rather than strategy. Garrett unplugged the diagnostic cable and stood stretching tension from shoulders that had been locked in position for too long. The old tablet screen dimmed, but didn't power down, battery warning flashing amber as it struggled to maintain charge under sustained use. They mirrored credentials through an abandoned maintenance node. His voice carried the weariness of someone delivering news that would make an already complicated situation worse. The same one your infrastructure vendor flagged as low priority during cost optimization. Vanessa's eyes narrowed, memory clearly working backward through quarterly reviews and budget approvals. That was reviewed, documented. On paper. The distinction mattered, hanging in the air between them like evidence in a trial neither wanted to face. The engineer nearest him swallowed hard. We signed off on that after executive approval. The vendor said the node was redundant, that maintaining it cost more than the security benefit justified. Silence again, different this time, not shock, but recognition. The kind that came from realizing mistakes made in conference rooms with PowerPoint presentations and cost-benefit analyses had consequences that couldn't be erased by reversing decisions or issuing new directives. Vanessa looked at Garrett differently now, not as a subordinate or even as an equal, but as someone holding information she didn't yet control and couldn't command him to surrender. Can you trace it? Yes. How long? Long enough that your investors upstairs will start asking why their preview dashboard stalled. He met her gaze without flinching, without the deference she was accustomed to receiving from people who wanted to keep their positions. Long enough that speculation will turn into narrative you can't walk back. Claire exhaled sharply, understanding clicking into place. We can't let them speculate in a vacuum. Vanessa turned toward the elevator, decision forming with the kind of speed that had built her career. We take this upstairs. If this is internal, it gets addressed publicly before rumors distort it. The engineers stiffened. Publicly. In front of the same investors who'd been sipping champagne 20 minutes ago, expecting carefully curated financial projections, and instead getting front-row seats to corporate crisis management. Garrett watched her carefully, reading the shift in posture, the micro-adjustments in expression that suggested she was running calculations about risk and reward, about what kind of transparency would stabilize confidence versus what kind would trigger panic. You humiliated me in front of them. He said it calmly. Statement of fact rather than accusation. If we handle this quietly, they'll never understand how close this company came to collapsing. She met his gaze, and for a moment something almost resembling respect flickered across her features. You want acknowledgement. I want accountability. The correction came firm but not aggressive. There's a difference. The corridor felt smaller now, like the building itself was listening, infrastructure holding its breath while humans decided how to proceed with information that could reshape everything, depending on who controlled the narrative. Claire stepped in, voice measured with the careful precision of someone whose job was preventing litigation before it started. Vanessa, if this is internal misconduct and we conceal it, liability multiplies. Transparency might actually stabilize confidence if we frame it correctly. The CEO's pride wrestled visibly with reality. 15 years of decisive leadership confronting a situation where decisiveness alone wouldn't solve the underlying problem. Above them, another notification alert echoed faintly, reminder that time was a luxury they couldn't afford. Garrett picked up his tool bag canvas strap, settling familiar across his shoulder. If we move now, I can trace the mirrored credentials from the executive console. But it has to happen where everyone can see it. The implication landed hard. Board members, investors, senior staff, witnesses. Not behind closed doors where stories could be shaped and facts could be negotiated, but in full view of the people whose capital kept the company solvent and whose trust could evaporate faster than server uptime. If you've ever seen someone underestimated until the truth forced its way into the light, this is where quiet strength turns visible. Not through proclamation, but through necessity that won't be denied. Vanessa studied him for a long moment, really seeing him for perhaps the first time since he'd walked away 8 years ago. The maintenance uniform that she'd dismissed as proof of diminished ambition now looked like exactly what it was: practical clothing worn by someone who understood that real work happened in places executives never visited, that foundations required constant attention from people willing to get their hands dirty. "Fine." The word came out clipped, stripped of pretense. "We go upstairs." The elevator doors slid open with a metallic clang that echoed down the corridor. As they stepped inside, the air felt heavier than before, not with panic, but with anticipation. The kind that preceded moments when carefully constructed facades crumbled and underlying truth became impossible to ignore. Vanessa didn't speak during the ascent. Claire watched the digital floor count climb, running through legal frameworks that would apply if this turned into the kind of public revelation that triggered SEC inquiries and shareholder lawsuits. Garrett stood still, eyes distant, not calculating code now, but consequences. Because if the trace revealed what he suspected, this wouldn't just be a cybersecurity issue. It would be exposure of decisions made for profit, of warnings ignored to protect quarterly reports, of vulnerabilities buried because acknowledging them would require admitting that aggressive expansion had come at costs no one wanted to quantify. The elevator dinged at the executive floor. Doors opened to a wave of anxious voices and glowing screens, investors clustered near glass walls, with phones out, murmuring among themselves with the kind of controlled urgency that preceded capital flight. Board members stood near the central console, tension visible in every rigid posture. The moment the group stepped out, Vanessa first, then Garrett, then Claire, conversation stalled. All eyes turned toward them. 40-plus people watching the CEO emerge from basement levels, accompanied by a maintenance worker and her chief legal officer. The juxtaposition was stark enough to command attention without words. Vanessa walked forward, first heels clicking against Vermont marble with the kind of confidence that came from refusing to acknowledge doubt even when it was warranted. But she didn't step ahead of Garrett this time. She stopped beside him, creating visual space that suggested collaboration rather than hierarchy. "Ladies and gentlemen," her voice carried across the marble and glass, amplified through the room's integrated sound system. "We experienced a contained security irregularity." Murmurs rose, immediately controlled but insistent. An older investor near the front, the one with the Cornell pin and silver hair, leaned forward slightly, attention sharpening. Vanessa continued, each word chosen with care. "This issue will be addressed transparently." Transparent. The word carried weight in rooms where opacity was default, where information flowed through carefully managed channels designed to prevent exactly the kind of public examination she was now inviting. Her gaze shifted to Garrett briefly, acknowledgement passing between them that couldn't be articulated in front of this audience but was visible to anyone paying attention. "Mr. Aldrich will walk us through the resolution process." A few hours ago, that same floor had nearly witnessed his removal by security. Now it waited for him to explain how he'd just prevented collapse of systems that processed hundreds of millions in annual transactions. Garrett moved toward the central console without hesitation or ceremony, tool bag still across his shoulder boots, leaving faint marks on marble polished to mirror finish. The massive display screens overhead blinked, replacing frozen financial projections with live system diagnostics projected larger than life above the boardroom table. Public, visible, irrefutable. He connected his device to the central console, old tablet, interfacing with cutting-edge infrastructure in ways that shouldn't work, but did because he'd designed both ends of the connection to speak the same fundamental language. Lines of code began scrolling across the screens, raw data stripped of the aesthetic wrapper that made technology palatable to non-technical audiences. This was infrastructure laid bare: authentication sequences, credential verification protocols, breach signatures, highlighted in red against green baselines. One investor whispered to the woman beside him, confusion evident. "They're showing us real-time breach analysis." Claire stepped forward, positioning herself where she could observe both the screens and the room's reactions. "Mr. Aldrich, walk us through what you found." professional framing giving him permission to speak with authority while establishing legal record that this disclosure was voluntary and complete. The mirrored credential was injected through a dormant maintenance node. Garrett's voice carried steady across the room. No technical jargon softened for lay understanding because clarity mattered more than comfort. It piggybacked on a legitimate executive token, copied the biometric hash, then masked itself as routine internal traffic. An investor near the glass raised his hand slightly. In plain English, it means someone with high-level clearance either authorized it or had their access duplicated without noticing. The distinction mattered, hanging between criminal intent and negligent vulnerability. The attack loop was sophisticated enough to test our defenses without triggering automated alerts. Whoever designed this knew our internal architecture intimately. Several heads turned sharply toward him now, not at the uniform, but at the implications of what he was describing. This wasn't script kiddies throwing exploits at random targets hoping something stuck. This was surgical, precise, the kind of operation that required inside knowledge or extensive reconnaissance. Garrett typed another command, isolating anomalies in the data stream. "Can you decrypt that credential identifier?" He glanced at Vanessa, giving her one last opportunity to stop what was about to happen. Once he decrypted the mirrored token and displayed it publicly, there would be no walking back, the exposure, no private conversations that could reshape narrative before it calcified into record. She held his gaze for half a breath, then nodded once. Permission granted. Consequences accepted. He entered the decryption sequence, fingers moving across the cracked screen with muscle memory precision. The system resisted for half a second, security protocols designed to prevent exactly this kind of exposure, fighting against override commands that predated those protocols. Then the blurred identifier resolved into clean, unmistakable text, glowing large across the overhead screens where every investor could read it. Derek Strauss, Chief Infrastructure Strategist. Gasps scattered through the room, sound rippling outward from people closest to the displays to those farther back who needed an extra second to process what they were seeing. Derek stood near the back of the executive cluster, face draining of color so rapidly it looked like someone had opened a valve. "That's not possible." The words came out immediately, reflexive denial, before thought could catch up to implication. "My credentials never left my device." Garrett didn't look at him yet, focus remaining on the screens where additional data was populating, timestamps, access logs, mirror creation protocols that showed exactly when and how the credential duplication had occurred. "Your credentials didn't have to leave." His response came calm, factual, no accusation coloring the delivery. "The exploit copied your biometric hash during the vendor migration update 3 years ago. It's been dormant since then, waiting for someone to activate it." Vanessa's head snapped toward Derek, anger flashing across features that had maintained careful neutrality. "You supervised that transition." "It was board approved." Derek shot back, voice rising with the desperation of someone watching their career implode in real time. "We reduced operational costs by 8% and streamlined and opened a maintenance node with legacy override access." Garrett's interruption was quiet but cut through Derek's defense like surgical steel. "Flagged as low priority, marked for monitoring, that never happened because the monitoring protocols required resources you'd eliminated to hit cost targets." Murmurs grew louder, investors no longer bothering to whisper as they processed implications. Claire tapped her tablet, already pulling up archived documentation, building the paper trail that would matter when this moved from crisis management to legal proceedings. Derek stepped backward slightly as attention consolidated on him, whispers spreading like contagion through the executive cluster. "This is circumstantial. You're projecting authority because you wrote some old code. I wrote the foundation," Garrett corrected quietly, finally turning to face him directly. "And foundations remember who alters them." A faint tremor of approval moved through the room, not applause but recognition. The kind that came from watching someone speak truth to power without raising their voice, without theatrics, just facts delivered with the weight of expertise that couldn't be dismissed or deflected. Vanessa inhaled deeply, weighing optics against necessity. Investors were watching. Board members were calculating risk exposure. Every second of hesitation would be analyzed in quarterly reviews and shareholder meetings for years. "Mr. Strauss," her voice carried formal weight now stripped of collegiality, "did you authorize any undocumented vendor adjustments during the infrastructure migration?" He hesitated, just long enough for the pause to register as damning for uncertainty to undermine whatever credibility remained. Claire noticed immediately lawyer instincts honed by years of depositions where silence spoke louder than words. "That hesitation isn't helping you." Derek's voice rose defensively, control slipping. "I followed strategic directives. We were under pressure to show growth to demonstrate efficiency gains that would justify market positioning. Everyone agreed the risk was minimal." Minimal. Garrett repeated the word, letting it hang. "Not non-existent." He tapped another key, and the display shifted to reveal archived internal memos, cost reduction proposals flagged with annotations like acceptable risk threshold and optimization opportunity. Document headers bore signatures and dates, official record of decisions made in conference rooms where consequences felt theoretical because they wouldn't manifest for years. Vanessa recognized the document formats instantly. She'd signed some of them herself during quarterly performance surges when board pressure demanded results that would impress Wall Street analysts and justify stock valuations that assumed perpetual growth. Derek stepped backward again as whispers intensified, investors exchanging glances that carried judgments forming in real time. "This isn't criminal. It's strategic scaling, necessary adaptation to competitive pressures." "It's negligence." Claire's voice came flat, legal assessment stripped of political softening. "And negligence becomes liability when it creates vulnerability that threatens client assets." The room felt different now. Minutes earlier it had been a stage for carefully choreographed investor relations. Now it was a tribunal exposure happening in full view of people whose capital kept the company solvent and whose trust could evaporate faster than server uptime. Vanessa straightened authority, recalibrating not through dominance, but through acknowledgement that transparency, however uncomfortable, was the only path forward that didn't end in catastrophic loss of credibility. "Mr. Strauss, pending immediate internal review, your system access is suspended effective now." Shock rippled through the executive floor, impact visible in faces that had expected many outcomes, but not public termination before the champagne had even been poured. Security moved not toward Garrett this time, but toward Derek, hands professional but firm, as they positioned themselves to escort him away from systems he could no longer be trusted to access. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. 20 minutes ago, these same security officers had been prepared to remove a maintenance worker for interrupting important proceedings. Now they were removing an executive whose decisions had nearly collapsed the infrastructure those proceedings depended on. Derek sputtered, face flushing. "You can't do this in front of investors." "We already are." Vanessa's response came cold, final, the voice of someone who'd made a decision and wouldn't be swayed by appeals to propriety or protocol. Security escorted him toward the elevators, his protests fading into polished distance as doors closed and sealed him away from the floor where his career had just ended, in front of 40 witnesses who would carry this story into boardrooms and investment committees across 3 states. The screens still glowed with trace data evidence, transparent and irrefutable, the kind of documentation that would survive legal challenges and audit inquiries because it had been generated and displayed in real time with no opportunity for retrospective editing. But Garrett didn't relax. His focus remained on the tablet where secondary data was forming beneath the surface patterns that suggested Derek's compromised credentials were symptoms of a larger problem rather than the problem itself. "The breach isn't just the loop." His voice cut through the murmurs still processing Derek's removal. "That was the distraction." Claire turned sharply. "Meaning?" "This was reconnaissance." He pulled up fresh data streams showing outbound connection attempts that had been masked beneath the more obvious attack signatures. Whoever launched this knows the system well enough to test boundaries without collapsing it. They were measuring response time, mapping who intervened. Vanessa's expression shifted from relief to renewed concern. "Mapping you?" He didn't answer directly. Instead, he isolated a ping that had been attempting to establish external communication, subtle enough to hide beneath normal traffic patterns, patient enough to wait for moments when automated monitoring was focused on more obvious threats. The mirrored credentials were step one. He gestured toward the outbound attempt displayed on screen. This is step two. Someone's trying to export architectural data while we're distracted cleaning up the mess they created. Claire's fingers tightened around her tablet. If that data reaches external servers, it hasn't yet. Garrett's interruption carried the weight of certainty rather than hope. But it will, unless we redirect it the same way we contained the loop. An investor stepped forward, older man with sharp eyes that had evaluated risk across 4 decades of technology investments. You're saying this attack has multiple layers, that what we just witnessed was a feint. I'm saying whoever designed this is sophisticated enough to create noise that draws attention while the real objective proceeds quietly. Garrett met the investor's gaze without deference, speaking as one professional to another rather than subordinate to authority. And they're betting we'll celebrate stopping the obvious threat without looking for the one that actually matters. The room went quieter, different quality to the silence now. Not shock, but focus attention, consolidating on screens that had shifted from showing crisis resolved to crisis evolving. Vanessa absorbed this with visible effort, every instinct trained to command outcomes, now confronting a situation where outcomes depended on technical expertise she didn't possess and couldn't fake. What do you need? Time. Simple answer to complex question. And authorization to trace the outbound connection before it completes. If I can isolate the receiving endpoint, we'll know who's orchestrating this. How long? Garrett glanced at the old Timex on his wrist, 4:35 p.m., 15 minutes until Sophie's school ended, and he was supposed to be there for pickup. Depends on how many layers they've buried the endpoint under. Could be minutes, could be longer. Claire stepped closer, legal mind already working through implications. If we trace this publicly in front of everyone, there's no controlling the narrative afterward. Whatever we find becomes immediate record. Vanessa looked from Claire to Garrett to the screen still displaying authentication signatures that proved internal compromise. She'd built her career on controlling information flow, on shaping narratives before they could shape themselves, on managing perception as carefully as she managed quarterly earnings. But control was an illusion when the foundation itself was compromised. And the only person who understood that foundation well enough to save it was standing in front of her, wearing work boots and carrying 8 years of warnings she'd ignored. Do it. 2 words, clean and final. Publicly. Let them see everything. Garrett nodded once, then turned back to the console and began setting up the trace. The trace initiated with a soft pulse across the overhead displays, digital pathways lighting up like arterial maps tracking infection through a body. Garrett's fingers moved across the tablet with practiced efficiency, routing the outbound connection attempt through monitoring protocols that would record every hop, every server, every attempt at obfuscation. 40 investors watched screens they didn't fully understand, displaying data that would determine whether their capital remained sound or became cautionary tales in risk management seminars. The executive floor had transformed from showcase to operating theater, polished surfaces reflecting tension that couldn't be hidden behind professional facades. Claire positioned herself where she could observe both Garrett's work and the room's reaction, lawyer instincts, cataloging who looked concerned versus who looked calculating, who was already composing exit strategies versus who was committed to seeing this through regardless of outcome. The first layer of the trace resolved quickly, outbound ping, attempting to route through what appeared to be standard analytics traffic, the kind of automated reporting that flowed constantly between corporate systems and cloud-based monitoring services. Except the destination wasn't a monitoring service. It was a shell company registered in Delaware with no physical address, and incorporation papers filed 3 months after the infrastructure migration that had introduced the vulnerabilities Derek's decisions had created. It's routing through a third-party analytics wrapper. Garrett's voice carried across the room without effort. Clear explanation for audiences ranging from technical staff to investors whose expertise was capital allocation rather than network architecture. Designed to look like performance reporting, but the actual destination. He typed another command, peeling back the wrapper to reveal the next layer underneath. The screen updated, showing a secondary server that belonged to a private equity holding company most people in the room would recognize from acquisition attempts that had been politely declined 2 years running. Murmurs spread faster now, recognition sparking connections that transformed technical crisis into something more dangerous, corporate espionage with faces and names attached. One investor near the front spoke loud enough to be heard across marble and glass. "That's not a vendor, that's Stratton Industrial." Vanessa's posture went rigid, shoulders pulling back in the involuntary response of someone whose worst suspicions were being confirmed in real time. Stratton Industrial Partners had attempted to acquire Harlan Dynamics twice in 5 years, offers that looked generous on paper, but came with terms that would have gutted the company's independence and turned it into a subsidiary absorbed into a portfolio of similar acquisitions. The second attempt had been particularly aggressive. Hostile takeover language wrapped in partnership rhetoric. Board pressure applied through investors who'd been promised returns that required accepting Stratton's terms. Vanessa had fought it personally, burning political capital and leveraging relationships to maintain control. The victory had been celebrated in trade publications as proof that smaller firms could still resist consolidation pressure from larger competitors. Apparently, Stratton had decided that if they couldn't buy Harlan Dynamics, they'd weaken it enough to make future acquisition attempts succeed. Garrett continued the trace, following the connection through another layer of obfuscation. This time a server cluster that appeared to be located somewhere in Northern Virginia based on routing signatures, but without completing the handshake he couldn't confirm exact geographic coordinates. Claire was already typing on her tablet, pulling up corporate registration documents, acquisition history, anything that would establish clear connection between the shell company and Stratton's known holdings. "If we can prove direct ownership of that shell, we will." Garrett didn't look up from his screen. "But first we need to let them think the probe succeeded. If we cut the connection too early, they'll know we traced it and destroy evidence on their end." The engineering team that had followed them up from B3 exchanged nervous glances. Letting an active security breach continue ran counter to every protocol they'd been trained to follow. Every instinct that said threats should be eliminated immediately rather than allowed to persist for strategic purposes. But Vanessa understood. Her expression shifted from alarm to calculation. The CEO, who'd built an empire, recognizing that sometimes you had to let adversaries commit fully before springing the trap. "How long?" 30 seconds. Garrett's eyes tracked data packets flowing through the connection, watching payload size increase as the shell company's server began receiving architectural blueprints it wasn't authorized to access. Long enough to establish intent, not long enough to complete the transfer. Time moved differently when you were counting it in discrete seconds, each one carrying weight that accumulated into evidence that would survive legal challenges and regulatory inquiries. The room held collective breath, investors watching screens display theft in progress, witnessing corporate espionage unfold with the kind of transparency that would make this moment impossible to dispute or reframe. 20 seconds. The payload continued transmitting encrypted data, moving through digital channels that looked legitimate enough to bypass automated security unless someone was watching specifically for this pattern. Garrett had been watching since the moment he'd noticed the secondary ping back in B3, patient enough to let the attack develop rather than shutting it down prematurely. 15 seconds. Claire found what she was looking for: corporate registration documents showing the Delaware Shell Company's ownership traced through 3 layers of holding companies before resolving to a subsidiary of Stratton Industrial Partners. The connection was deliberately obscured, but documented thoroughly enough that forensic accounting would unravel it within hours once proper investigations began. 10 seconds. An investor in the back pulled out his phone not to check messages, but to photograph the screens displaying evidence of industrial espionage executed against a company he'd invested capital in. Others followed suit, creating redundant documentation that Stratton wouldn't be able to suppress through legal challenges or settlement negotiations. 5 seconds. Garrett's finger hovered over the command that would sever the connection, cleanly isolating the trace logs and preserving evidence while preventing any additional data from reaching servers that shouldn't have access to Harlan Dynamics' proprietary architecture. 0. He executed the command with precision, cutting the connection at the exact moment when payload size confirmed intent, but before complete transfer could occur. The screen showed the trace path frozen in amber, every hop documented, every server identified, the entire route from internal systems to Stratton's infrastructure preserved in logs that would serve as exhibits in litigation that would probably stretch across years. Silence followed. Not the shocked variety that had greeted Derek's exposure, but something heavier, the quiet of people processing implications that extended beyond immediate crisis into questions about trust and competition, and how far companies would go to gain advantage over rivals who refused to be acquired on unfavorable terms. The name glowed on the overhead displays, where everyone could see, it could photograph, it could carry it out of this building and into boardrooms where decisions about capital allocation and risk tolerance would be reconsidered in light of evidence that apparently friendly competitors were actively trying to sabotage infrastructure. Vanessa broke the silence, first voice carrying the kind of control that came from making decisions under pressure when every option had costs. Ladies and gentlemen, what you've witnessed today wasn't weakness. It was transparency. She let the words settle before continuing, gaze sweeping across investors whose expressions ranged from impressed to alarmed to calculating. We were tested. We responded. And we will pursue legal recourse against those who attempted to undermine this company's foundation. Low murmur of approval rippled through the executive cluster, tentative but present. This wasn't the carefully choreographed presentation they'd expected when they'd flown to Chicago for quarterly previews. This was something rawer, more honest than most corporate communications ever approached. The older investor with the Cornell pin stepped forward, silver hair catching light from overhead fixtures that suddenly seemed harsher than decorative. Ms. Harlan, if not for Mr. Aldrich. He didn't finish the sentence. Everyone understood what he was implying, that without Garrett's intervention they'd currently be watching investor portals collapse, while Stratton Industrial harvested architectural blueprints that would give them everything needed to replicate Harlan Dynamics' competitive advantages. Vanessa's gaze moved to Garrett, really seeing him perhaps for the first time since he'd stepped down 8 years ago to prioritize Sophie's medical needs over corporate advancement. The maintenance uniform didn't look diminished anymore. It looked honest in ways that designer suits sometimes weren't, practical clothing worn by someone who understood that real expertise manifested in solving problems rather than managing perception. Without institutional memory, she paused, choosing words carefully, we would be having a very different conversation right now. Acknowledgement without quite being apology, recognition without fully admitting how thoroughly she'd misjudged the value of someone who'd chosen family over career trajectory. But it was more than she'd given most people who'd left positions of authority, more than protocol required in rooms where hierarchy determined who received credit for success. Something shifted in the air between them, invisible but palpable. The recalibration that happened when power dynamics that had seemed fixed revealed themselves to be more fluid than anyone had assumed. Then Vanessa did something no one expected. She stepped aside physically, creating space in the center of the executive floor, opening visual territory that suggested invitation rather than command. Mr. Aldrich, would you care to address everyone here? The question landed with weight that extended beyond its simple phrasing. 20 minutes ago, this floor had nearly witnessed his removal by security guards who'd been told he didn't belong among people making decisions that moved markets. Now, its most powerful occupant was offering him platform to speak directly to investors whose capital determined whether companies thrived or withered. Garrett felt 40 pairs of eyes shift toward him, attention consolidating with the kind of focus that came from watching someone defy expectations thoroughly enough to demand reassessment. He could decline, return to maintenance corridors where expectations were simple and consequences played out in broken HVAC units rather than quarterly earnings reports. But declining would leave gaps in understanding that would fill themselves with speculation, would let this moment pass without establishing the kind of accountability that prevented future Derek Strausses from making decisions that prioritized short-term metrics over long-term stability. He stepped forward, not dramatically, not with any theatrical awareness of the moment's significance, but with the steady gait of someone who'd spent 8 years learning that real authority came from competence rather than titles. The marble felt solid beneath his boots, expensive stone installed by people who'd understood that foundations mattered even when they were buried beneath surfaces designed to impress rather than endure. He stood where Vanessa had stood when issuing her 10-second ultimatum, where Derek had stood during quarterly reviews that praised cost optimization without questioning underlying trade-offs. "I don't have a prepared speech." His voice carried naturally across the space, clear without needing amplification because the room had gone quiet enough that even breathing seemed subdued. "But I'll say this." He let the pause extend just long enough for people to lean forward slightly, attention sharpening. "Systems don't fail because they're attacked." The words came out measured, each one chosen for precision rather than rhetoric. "They fail because someone decided protection was optional." The statement landed clean, no wasted syllables, the kind of observation that felt obvious in hindsight, but revolutionary when spoken aloud in rooms where convenience usually trumped caution. Several executives shifted uncomfortably, recognizing themselves in the description whether they wanted to or not. Board members who'd approved cost optimizations without questioning security implications. Managers who'd pushed efficiency metrics without understanding what was being optimized away. Investors who'd demanded margin improvements without asking whether those improvements came at costs that wouldn't show up in quarterly reports until it was too late to matter. Garrett continued, voice steady but carrying undertones that suggested he was speaking from experience earned rather than theory absorbed. "We weren't targeted because we were weak. We were targeted because someone believed we'd prioritize appearance over structure." Vanessa's expression flickered, recognition perhaps of her own tendencies reflected back with uncomfortable accuracy. She'd built Harlan Dynamics by projecting confidence that bordered on invincibility, by convincing investors and competitors alike that the company was stronger than any challenge it might face. That projection had worked right up until it attracted adversaries who tested whether the foundation matched the facade. Today proved that assumption wrong. Garrett's gaze moved across faces, watching him with varying degrees of attention. But prevention costs less than recovery. It always has. It always will. Simple economics delivered without accusation but impossible to dismiss as anything other than critique of decisions that had seemed rational when consequences felt theoretical. An investor, near the glass woman in her 50s Navy suit expression that suggested she'd heard plenty of corporate speeches and wasn't easily impressed, nodded slowly. Not agreement exactly, but acknowledgement that he was saying something worth considering rather than filling time with platitudes. Garrett paused before continuing, weighing whether to push further or stop while he had credibility. The Timex on his wrist showed 4:47 p.m. 13 minutes past when he should have left to make Sophie's pickup on time. She'd understand, she always did when work ran late, but understanding didn't eliminate the guilt that came from choosing between responsibilities that both mattered. "If we rebuild this foundation properly," he finished the thought without rushing, giving each word space to register, "no competitor will need to test us again. They'll know the answer before they ask the question." He stepped back. No dramatic conclusion, no call to action. Just information delivered by someone whose expertise had been demonstrated through results rather than credentials. The kind of speech that worked because it didn't try too hard, because it respected the audience's intelligence enough to let them draw their own conclusions. The silence that followed felt different from earlier varieties, not shocked or uncertain but thoughtful. Processing. The older investor with the Cornell pin who'd questioned Vanessa earlier spoke again, voice carrying across marble that suddenly seemed less intimidating than it had when Garrett first stepped onto this floor. I've invested in technology companies for 40 years. This is the first time I've seen a CEO admit mistakes publicly and watched someone in work boots save the entire operation. He paused, letting the observation settle. That's the kind of integrity I want my portfolio supporting. Murmurs of agreement spread through the investor cluster, tentative at first, but gaining momentum as people who'd been uncertain about how to react found permission in someone else's assessment. Not universal approval. Some faces still showed skepticism or calculation, but enough consensus to shift the room's emotional center from crisis to something approaching stability. Vanessa absorbed this feedback with visible effort, CEO instincts, reading the temperature and recognizing that whatever authority she'd lost through Derek's failures was being partially restored through transparency she'd been forced to accept rather than chosen strategically. Not the outcome she'd planned when champagne was being chilled and quarterly projections were being polished, but better than alternatives that had seemed inevitable 30 minutes ago. Effective immediately. Her voice carried formal weight now, announcement rather than conversation. Harlan Dynamics will undergo complete structural cybersecurity overhaul led by Mr. Aldrich. The words hung in air, thick with implications. Complete overhaul. Not patchwork or incremental improvements, but fundamental reconstruction. The kind of project that would consume resources and demand attention from executives who'd grown comfortable treating security as someone else's problem. An investor near the front raised the obvious question. Will he be returning as chief security architect? Vanessa's response came without hesitation, this time decision already made. If he accepts. 40 pairs of eyes shifted back to Garrett, waiting for response to an offer that represented validation and opportunity and the kind of career restoration that most people would accept immediately without negotiation. He looked past the investors toward windows where Chicago's skyline was visible through glass that had been cleaned that morning by people whose names no one in this room would remember. The city spread out in geometric patterns, buildings stacked like the layers of infrastructure he'd spent 8 years maintaining, visible surfaces supported by foundations that only became important when they failed. I'll oversee the rebuild. His voice carried the same steady tone he'd used throughout, no triumph or satisfaction coloring the acceptance. But I won't sacrifice what matters most. Vanessa held his gaze, question forming before she voiced it. Which is, my daughter. Simple statement, 2 words that carried 8 years of decisions that had confused people who measured success through advancement rather than presence. She has a rheumatology appointment tomorrow morning. Blood work that can't be rescheduled. I need to be there. The specificity cut through corporate abstractions, reminding everyone that beneath professional obligations were human realities that didn't care about quarterly projections or investor relations. A few executives looked uncomfortable, unused to hearing personal constraints acknowledged so directly in spaces designed for discussing business strategy. But something changed in Vanessa's expression. Not pity, but something closer to understanding. For 8 years, she'd assumed Garrett had abandoned his career because he lacked ambition or couldn't handle pressure. Now she was finally seeing what he'd tried to explain in his resignation letter, that there were different kinds of strength, different ways to measure what mattered, different choices that looked like weakness to people who'd never had to make them. Claire stepped forward, legal mind already solving problems before they became obstacles. Flexible oversight can be arranged. Remote access for most functions, on-site presence when critical decisions require it. Garrett nodded appreciation for the practical framework, but his attention stayed on Vanessa. One condition. Her eyebrow lifted, slightly surprised that he was negotiating when he held leverage curiosity about what someone who'd just saved the company would demand as price for continuing. Security protocols get rebuilt from foundation up. No cost-cutting at the expense of structural integrity. Not now. Not ever. His voice firmed, carrying the weight of someone who'd watched warnings ignored and was done being diplomatic about consequences. If that's not acceptable, find someone else. The ultimatum hung between them, role reversal complete. 25 minutes ago, she'd given him 10 seconds to leave. Now he was setting terms for staying, establishing boundaries that would prevent future executives from making Derek's mistakes. Vanessa's smile appeared slowly small but genuine. You negotiate boldly for someone who was almost escorted out. I negotiate because the foundation deserves it. No smile in return, no softening of stance. People's retirement accounts deserve it. Their kids' college funds deserve it. Everything built on top of infrastructure deserves knowing that infrastructure won't collapse because someone wanted quarterly numbers to look impressive. The words carried conviction that couldn't be manufactured, the kind that came from understanding that abstract financial instruments represented actual human stakes, medical bills and mortgages and futures that could evaporate if the systems processing them were built on compromised foundations. Vanessa extended her hand, not to dismiss or command, but to acknowledge that they were entering arrangement built on mutual respect rather than hierarchy. This time, no ultimatums. He shook her hand. Grip firm but brief sealing agreement that would reshape how Harlan Dynamics approached security for years to come. The handshake lasted exactly long enough to communicate seriousness without becoming performance. Around them, the executive floor had transformed completely from what it had been when Garrett first stepped off the service elevator. Investors who'd been preparing to watch carefully curated presentations were instead witnessing the kind of unscripted transparency that happened when crisis forced honesty that wouldn't have emerged through normal corporate communications. The screens still displayed trace logs, evidence of industrial espionage that would fuel litigation and regulatory inquiries and probably restructure how technology companies thought about protecting proprietary architecture from competitors willing to use illegal means to gain advantages they couldn't achieve through legitimate competition. Garrett picked up his tool bag canvas strap, settling familiar across his shoulder. Same uniform, same boots, same equipment he'd been carrying when security had positioned themselves to escort him away. But the gravity had shifted. He was no longer an interruption to be managed, but an architect whose expertise had just been validated in the most public way possible. He moved toward the elevators without ceremony, aware that investors were watching but not performing for their attention. The work was done. Derek had been exposed. Stratton's espionage had been documented. The immediate crisis had been contained. Now he needed to get to Sophie's school before she started wondering whether he'd forgotten, before the worry that sometimes crept into her eyes when appointments ran late, and she imagined worst-case scenarios that 9-year-olds shouldn't have to contemplate. Vanessa watched him go, not with the irritation she'd shown earlier, but with something approaching respect. For 8 years she'd thought he'd been weak for choosing family over career. Today she'd learned that strength had more dimensions than she'd understood, that someone could walk away from power without losing authority. That foundations, whether architectural or personal, required maintenance from people willing to prioritize what endured over what impressed. The elevator doors opened. Before Garrett could step inside, the older investor with the Cornell pin moved to intercept, extending his hand. 40 years evaluating technology investments. This is the first time I've seen integrity trump credentials. His handshake was firm respect between professionals who understood that competence mattered more than pedigree. Whatever Vanessa's paying you, it's not enough. Garrett's response came quiet, meant for the investor rather than the room. I'm not doing this for money. I know. That's why you're worth it. The investor released his hand, stepping back with a nod that carried weight beyond the gesture. The elevator descended through floors that had witnessed the entire crisis without knowing it. Employees working at desks while infrastructure strained beneath them. Administrative staff processing paperwork while authentication cascades collapsed. Security monitoring cameras while servers fought off intrusion attempts that would have destroyed the company if Garrett hadn't been in the building at exactly the right moment to recognize patterns that no one else would have noticed. The lobby opened before him, polished and professional, designed to project success to clients who wouldn't see the mechanical spaces where that success was actually built. People moved through with the casual confidence of employees who didn't know how close they'd come to losing jobs. Benefits, retirement accounts that depended on the company remaining solvent. Outside, Chicago's afternoon had shifted into early evening. The rain that had threatened earlier had moved through, leaving streets wet, but clearing city lights beginning to flicker on as natural light faded. The air smelled clean, washed free of the day's accumulated exhaust and tension. Garrett inhaled deeply, feeling pressure drain from shoulders that had carried it since the moment he'd noticed the first screen flicker upstairs. His phone buzzed Sophie, probably wondering where he was, why pickup was running late, whether everything was okay. He pulled it out, expecting text messages, finding instead a single notification from an email account he rarely checked. Subject line: official appointment, Chief Security Architect. He didn't open it, not yet. First, he needed to get to Sophie, needed to see her face and confirm that the foundation he'd actually built, the one that mattered more than any corporate infrastructure, was still solid, despite the day's chaos. The parking structure was 3 blocks away, far enough that his boots clicked rhythmically against sidewalks still damp from rain. Other pedestrians moved past without noticing him, just another maintenance worker finishing his shift, indistinguishable from thousands of others who kept cities running without expecting recognition. Exactly how he preferred it. His phone buzzed again. Sophie this time, message preview visible on the cracked screen. Dad, Mrs. Chen says you're running late. Everything okay? He typed back quickly. On my way. Traffic. Pizza tonight. Her response came immediately. Extra cheese. Simple exchange, ordinary in every way, except that it reminded him why he'd made every choice that had confused people who measured success through promotions rather than presence. Sophie's emoji carried more weight than any executive title, represented priorities that made sense in ways that quarterly earnings never quite managed. The parking structure elevator smelled like concrete and motor oil, industrial scents that felt more honest than the marble and expensive polish of executive floors. His truck sat on the third-level Ford F-150, 10 years old, scratched paint and worn seats, but mechanically sound because he maintained it the same way he maintained building infrastructure, with attention to fundamentals rather than aesthetics. The engine started on the first turn, reliable in ways that mattered more than impressive. He pulled out into traffic that was heavy but moving, Chicago's rush hour settling into its familiar rhythm of stops and starts that would get him to Sophie's school 15 minutes late, but not so late that she'd worry. As he drove, his mind stayed with what had happened, not with pride at having been right or satisfaction at Derek's exposure, but with the weight of knowing that institutional vulnerabilities ran deeper than any single person's negligence. Stratton Industrial wouldn't be the last competitor to test Harlan Dynamics' defenses. The next attack would be more sophisticated, would learn from this failure, would probe different vulnerabilities that couldn't be predicted until someone tried exploiting them. Rebuilding the foundation properly would take months, maybe years, would require resources and attention from executives who'd rather focus on expansion than security, would demand budget allocations that wouldn't show up as profit. In quarterly reports would mean saying no to optimizations that looked good on paper, but created risks that wouldn't manifest until long after the people who'd approved them had moved to other positions. But it was necessary. And now he had authority to make it happen, backed by investors who'd seen firsthand what happened when foundations were neglected in favor of margins. The school parking lot was mostly empty, other parents having already collected their children and headed home to dinner and homework and evening routines that didn't include emergency responses to corporate espionage. Sophie waited on the steps with Mrs. Chen, her teacher, small for 9, dark hair and a ponytail that needed redoing, backpack almost as large as her torso. She saw his truck and waved, smile breaking across features that carried both his stubbornness and her mother's warmth. The mother who'd died 6 years ago from complications that no amount of money or medical expertise had been able to prevent, leaving Garrett to navigate single parenthood while Sophie navigated lupus and grief in equal measure. He pulled up to the curb and she climbed in, backpack thumping against the seat. "You're late." "I know, work ran long." He didn't elaborate. Didn't explain that he'd just saved a multi-million-dollar company from collapse, or been offered his old position back, or witnessed industrial espionage get exposed in real time. Those details didn't matter compared to making sure she knew he'd gotten there, that work hadn't made him forget what actually mattered. "Did you fix something important?" Her question came casual, genuine curiosity without any awareness of how accurate it was. "Yeah, something that was broken for a long time." He pulled back into traffic, heading toward their apartment on the city's northwest side, where rent was reasonable and neighbors knew each other's names. "Pizza sound good, with extra cheese," she confirmed, pulling homework from her backpack. "And can we watch the documentary about deep-sea fish, the one that was on last week?" "Deal." They drove in comfortable silence, radio playing softly, city lights beginning to glow brighter as evening settled in fully. This was the foundation that actually mattered, not server architecture or authentication cascades or quarterly projections, but the simple reliability of showing up, being present, maintaining the structures that held a life together when everything else threatened to fall apart. His phone buzzed one more time, text from Vanessa, brief and professional. "Press briefing complete. Investors stable. Thank you." He glanced at it, acknowledged silently, then put the phone in his pocket and focused on driving. Tomorrow he'd respond to the formal appointment offer, would start mapping out the security overhaul that would consume the next year of his professional life, would begin the work of rebuilding infrastructure that should never have been allowed to deteriorate in the first place. But tonight belonged to Sophie and pizza, and documentaries about creatures that survived in environments where most life couldn't exist. Appropriate viewing for a girl who'd learned to thrive despite an immune system that attacked her own body, who'd developed strength that had nothing to do with physical power and everything to do with refusing to let circumstances define limits. Foundations don't fail because they're attacked. They fail because someone decided protecting them was optional. He'd said it to a room full of investors, meant it as critique of corporate priorities. But it applied equally to the foundation sitting beside him, asking questions about bioluminescent fish, while carefully not mentioning that her joints ached from the day's weather changes, or that she'd need another round of blood work tomorrow to make sure her medication levels were correct. Protecting that foundation had never been optional. Never would be. And if that meant negotiating flexible oversight instead of accepting full-time executive positions, if it meant choosing presence over prestige, if it meant being the kind of architect who understood that the most important structures were the ones built from attention and reliability rather than ambition and recognition, then those were choices he'd make again without hesitation. The apartment building came into view, modest brick structure that had seen better decades, but maintained the essentials: heat that worked, plumbing that didn't leak, neighbors who looked out for each other when storms knocked out power or medical emergencies required someone to watch Sophie while Garrett handled logistics. They climbed stairs to the third floor, Sophie's backpack thumping against her back with each step, Garrett's tool bag still slung across his shoulder because he hadn't bothered removing it. Inside the apartment was small but functional two-bedrooms kitchen with appliances that predated most current technology but still cooked food reliably, living room with a couch purchased second-hand, and a television that worked well enough for documentary streaming. Home. Not impressive by executive standards, but solid in ways that mattered more than square footage. Sophie dropped her backpack and headed for her room to change out of school clothes. Garrett set his tool bag by the door, pulled out his phone, and finally opened the email from Vanessa. The appointment letter was formal, comprehensive, detailed enough to make clear this wasn't symbolic gesture, but actual authority backed by budget allocations and reporting structures that would give him power to implement changes that previous security architects had only been able to recommend. He skimmed through compensation packages and benefit details, stopped at the section outlining work arrangements. Flexible remote oversight with on-site presence as operationally required, schedule to accommodate family medical needs per discussion with Chief Legal Officer. Claire had been efficient translating his conditions into HR language that would survive policy reviews and ensure Sophie's appointments wouldn't conflict with corporate demands, the kind of practical problem-solving that made good lawyers invaluable. At the bottom, handwritten note from Vanessa, actual handwriting scanned and inserted, personal touch in otherwise formal document. Build it right. Take whatever time you need. VH. He read it twice, looking for subtext or qualification, finding only straightforward acknowledgement that some things couldn't be rushed without compromising quality. That prevention required investment beyond what quarterly thinking allowed. That foundations deserved the kind of attention most people only gave to surfaces. Sophie emerged in sweatpants and oversized t-shirt, hair down, now comfortable in ways she couldn't be at school, where other kids didn't always understand why she needed accommodations, or got tired more easily, or had to miss classes for medical appointments. Pizza time. Her voice carried hope, tempered by experience that sometimes plans changed when work interfered. Pizza time. He confirmed, setting the phone down and giving her his full attention. Extra cheese documentary about weird fish and maybe ice cream if there's any left in the freezer. Her smile brightened simple pleasure in reliable routine after days that often felt unpredictable despite everyone's best efforts at stability. Experience and skill don't become obsolete. They're foundations that every innovation builds on. And foundations never go out of style, they just get buried beneath surfaces until someone needs to dig down and remember what actually holds everything up. The words hadn't made it into his speech upstairs, had formed in his mind during the drive home while thinking about what made structures endure. But they captured something essential about why he'd been able to save Harlan Dynamics when newer architects with better credentials couldn't, because he'd been there when the foundation was laid, had understood not just how it worked, but why it had been designed that way, had recognized patterns that only became visible when you'd lived with infrastructure long enough to see how it aged. That kind of knowledge couldn't be outsourced or optimized away, couldn't be replaced by consultants who showed up for quarterly audits and left without understanding how systems actually functioned under stress, couldn't be duplicated by reading documentation that was always incomplete because the people who wrote it assumed too much or explained too little or simply forgot details that had seemed obvious at the time. Institutional memory mattered. Experience mattered. The kind of expertise that came from staying with something long enough to see it evolve mattered. And tonight what mattered most was keeping promises to a 9-year-old who deserved pizza and documentaries and the certainty that when her father said he'd be there, he actually would be, even if it meant negotiating with CEOs and restructuring corporate positions to accommodate medical appointments that couldn't be rescheduled. The pizza arrived 20 minutes later, extra cheese as ordered, still hot enough to burn the roof of your mouth if you weren't careful. They ate on the couch while watching organisms that survived crushing pressure and perpetual darkness by developing adaptations that looked bizarre to surface dwellers, but made perfect sense in environments where normal rules didn't apply. Sophie fell asleep halfway through the documentary, curled against his side, breathing steady in the way that confirmed her body was having a good day, despite the joint pain she'd mentioned briefly before dinner. He let the documentary play through to its conclusion, unwilling to move and risk waking her when rest was always valuable currency in managing chronic illness. When the credits rolled, he carried her to bed, lighter than she should be for her age, but stronger than medical statistics suggested, defying expectations through stubborn refusal to let lupus define her capabilities. He tucked her in, adjusted the nightlight that helped with occasional anxiety about medical procedures, and stood for a moment watching her sleep with the kind of fierce protectiveness that had driven every decision for 8 years. This was the foundation that mattered. Everything else, executive titles, quarterly projections, investor confidence, was structure built on top, important, but secondary to the underlying requirement that Sophie had what she needed to thrive, despite challenges that would overwhelm people with less resilience. Back in the living room, he finally replied to Vanessa's email. Terms accepted. Work begins Monday. Remote setup required by week's end. First priority, comprehensive architecture audit, starting with legacy authentication systems. Timeline 6 to 8 weeks for preliminary assessment, 6 to 12 months for complete overhaul pending board approval. We'll submit detailed proposal by Friday. Professional, comprehensive, establishing expectations that couldn't be compressed or compromised without undermining the entire purpose of bringing him back. If they wanted it done right, it would take time. If they wanted it done fast, they should find someone else. Her response came within minutes, even though it was past normal business hours. Approved. Board meeting scheduled for Monday afternoon to formalize budget allocation. Your presence required remotely unless you prefer on-site. Friday proposal deadline confirmed. Sleep well knowing you saved more than infrastructure today. VH. He smiled faintly at the closing line recognition that she understood at least intellectually that victories measured in prevented disasters mattered as much as those measured in quarterly growth. Tomorrow would bring blood work and rheumatology consultations and careful monitoring of medication levels that kept Sophie's immune system from destroying her kidneys. Next week would bring security audits and budget negotiations and the grinding work of rebuilding infrastructure that should never have been allowed to deteriorate. But tonight, his daughter was sleeping peacefully down the hall. Pizza boxes sat empty on the counter, and Chicago's lights glowed outside windows that framed a city full of buildings held up by foundations that most people never thought about until something went wrong. He'd spent 8 years maintaining those foundations, keeping buildings running, while executives made decisions in spaces designed to insulate them from the labor that made their decisions possible. Now, he had opportunity to rebuild infrastructure that would protect not just Harlan Dynamics, but everyone whose livelihoods depended on systems that processed their paychecks and retirement contributions and medical benefits. It was important work, essential even, the kind that wouldn't generate headlines but would prevent catastrophes that would. And he'd do it on his own terms with flexibility that honored commitments to Sophie while ensuring that corporate infrastructure got the attention it deserved from someone who understood that prevention would always cost less than recovery in money, in trust in the human toll of systems failing when people depended on them most. Garrett Aldrich had been given 10 seconds to leave an executive floor where he didn't belong. Instead, he'd stayed, solved the crisis others couldn't see coming, and emerged with authority to rebuild foundations that would endure long after quarterly pressures faded into historical footnotes. But the real victory wasn't the executive title or the investor confidence or even the exposure of industrial espionage. It was walking through his apartment door on time for pizza and documentaries, keeping promises to the person who mattered most, maintaining the foundation that held his actual life together when everything else was just architecture built on top. That was the foundation worth protecting, always had been, always would be.